Of course, I would like to begin my intervention by thanking you for the organizer, thank you to the Colin for inviting me here. It's not my first time in Vicenza, but it's my first time in my new current capacities. It's always a pleasure, and it's a very important opportunity for me today, because this was a very inspiring and learning opportunity. As it was said, I started only a few months ago as the special representative, and today I'm coming here more not for sharing lessons learned, but really to listening and to learn from you. And I learn a lot, so thank you very much for this. The NATO SPA-COE represent an asset for NATO when it comes to training programs, doctrine, and lessons learned in the field of stability policing. And it's very important for me to understand how we can connect my mandate and what I do with what you do. So I think that is really important for us at the NATO HQ to benefit from the experience of the different Center of Excellence. And of course, it's very dear to my heart, the center here, because this is my country, but also because of the topic that are covered here. The core of my mandate, as you said, I'm the special representative for women, peace and security. So I don't know if you are all familiar with what it means. Maybe you know this agenda very well, but just allow me to give you just a few main concepts and why this is important for NATO. The core of my work is rooted in what is called the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, that together with 9 additional resolutions adopted between the year 2000 and the year 2020, create what is called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. This agenda has two main messages. The first is that war affects women and men and children in different ways, and the security is perceived differently. Therefore, it is particularly important that women are involved as active participants and agent of change in prevention and managing and resolving conflicts. And this comes also in all the stabilization of the country. This is what we are talking about today. And this agenda is extremely important, and how this agenda has been framed in Afghanistan, where it is the major theater where the work of NATO in this field has, I would say, has started. So let me turn to the focus of this conference and understand how the operation in Afghanistan and the connection with the development of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and our policy at NATO. For NATO Afghanistan and for NATO and WPS has been extremely important. NATO has developed its first policy for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in 2007. And in 2009, we have deployed our first gender advisor on the field, including in Afghanistan. Based on that experience, the Alliance decided to develop the first action plan, which was really only focused on how gender has to be mainstream and implemented when we are deployed in an operation. And exactly from this theater, from our 20 years of presence in Kosovo, and especially in Afghanistan, that we have learned how important it is to integrate a gender perspective and to have gender advisors present when we are deployed on the field. We are no longer present, and what does this mean for NATO? For nearly 20 years, NATO was deployed in Afghanistan under United Nations Security Council mandate. This mission came to an end, and NATO took significant lessons learned. When it comes to the gender advisors, it was very clear that it was essential for us to connect with the population, to brief the commander, to bring a different perspective. Having female engagement teams create a possibility to connect with the population in a way that it's not possible where only men are deployed. The cultural impact, the gender perspective, the sensitivity, what is the stabilization implies are all the dimensions that are also embedded and rooted on the work that we are doing. Education, equality, and freedom of expression are fundamental human rights. Access to education for Afghan girls and women had been one of the biggest achievements of grassroots advocacy support by NATO's engagement in Afghanistan. But since the Taliban takeover, NATO has suspended all support to Afghanistan as a partner because the Taliban are turning back the clock on hard-fought progress. But while NATO is no longer present as an institution, NATO allies, 30 individual allies, soon to be 32, remain engaged. Individual liberty, democracy, rule of law, human rights are the common values of our alliance, and this is where the values that we still share, and each of us as an ally are promoting as part of the alliance, but also on our individual activities. In August 2021, more than 1,020 people were evacuated from Kabul airport as part of the coalition effort. By providing humanitarian support, helping throughout different voluntary and non-governmental organizations, individual allies continue to provide significant support and development aid to try to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. Allies are focused, allies are closely monitoring, and allies are calling on the Taliban government to make good on their promises. Allies continue to support all Afghans who are working to uphold their human rights, including freedom of expression, equality, and the right of education for girls and women. And any future Afghan government must adhere to the Afghanistan international obligation, safeguard to human rights in all Afghans, particularly women, children, and minorities, uphold the rule of law, allow unhindered humanitarian access, and ensure that Afghanistan never again serves as a safe haven for terrorists. As the NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, of course, the role, the rights and the situation of Afghan women and girls is one of my main concerns. In the over 2 decades of NATO's presence, we have helped to support Afghan social progress, including in relation to women's rights, and encouraging the direct participation of women in the democratic process. Women have been involved in all aspects of the society and the political life, as we have also seen and heard from the previous speakers. And their role has been essential in all aspects of peace building, in the pursuit of societal stability and prosperity. It is clear that the current insecurity and situation and the pushback against the rights to education, the rights in participating in public and political life, the physical violence, is alarming, and it will remain high on my agenda. I'm in touch with women from the civil society, I'm in touch with negotiators, mediators, I'm in touch with women both in the diaspora and inside the country. And as I said, even if NATO is no longer present, it doesn't mean that we, as an alliance, do not support the values and that we don't care about what is happening there. On the contrary. So let me assure that in my current role, I will continue to support when and wherever possible, including throughout national initiatives, every opportunity to protect the rights of Afghan women and girls. As Special Representative, as I said, my main focus on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but I am also responsible of the human security approach at NATO, and I have an entire unit that supports me in my work. These past months have been particularly important in both of the areas I'm covered, because for the first time, these two agendas have been included in the new strategic concept. So it has been a big progress. If we look at the concept in 2010, and if you look where none of these areas were mentioned, and if you look what was endorsed last week in Madrid, it is clear that the approach of the alliance and the commitment to implement this agenda have a different vision has completely changed. We move from integrating a gender perspective in everything we do, in promoting this as part of our common values. We do this because this represents who we are. And I think that this shift really shows how, as an alliance, we have improved our understanding and that how this is important when we operate. As stated in the nuclear strategic concept, human security, including the protection of civilians and civilian harm mitigation, is central to our approach to crisis prevention and management. We will work with other international actors to address the broader conditions fueling crisis and pervasive instability and contribute to stabilization and reconstruction. Furthermore, NATO has officially outlined its approach towards human security by adopting a document with the definitions of the proper definition of human security and its guiding principle. The document was also endorsed last week by heads of state and government, showing that human security matters to NATO. It is at the heart of who we are and what we do, as I said, an alliance of democracies, of women and men, working together to protect our people and our values, freedom, equality, and human rights. For NATO, this means the adoption of a human rights approach to crisis management, one that provides a new approach to the range of 21st century global challenges and how the alliance must respond to them. The security of humans, the human security, how we call it, encompasses a wide scope of threats individual and community face. At both a political and operational level, human security must put people at the center of security threat considerations. Therefore, human security has a people-centered, multi-sectoral approach to national and international security that gives the primacy to the empowerment of people. The report of independent group of the NATO 2030 agenda noted last year that emphasizing the value of human dignity and security differentiates NATO from authoritarian rivals and terrorist groups. Taking a human security approach is a way to contribute to lasting peace and security. It is more difficult to improve stability or end conflict and achieve lasting peace in communities that have suffered from violations that tear at the social fabric and impinge on human dignity. Therefore, attention to human security can enhance any operation, mission, or activity that NATO undertakes. By contrast, inattention to human security can undercut the effectiveness and sustainability of NATO's activities and actions. For NATO, the term human security refers to cross-cutting topics from protection of civilians to children and armed conflict, conflict-related sexual violence, cultural property protection, and combating trafficking of human beings. And they are all underpinned by a gender analysis. This is why we decided to step up our work on human security by defining it and giving it a framework document to address even more actively the impact of conflict and crisis have on women, men and children, and in terms of how we plan and act to help improve their security in the immediate term and over time. By expanding our view of security, integration of a gender perspective is possible. Women and men, as I said, understand security differently, and as a progressive alliance, we need to recognize and apply this fundamental difference. The baseline for human security is translating our values, the one I mentioned, into action, and this means the ability to protect civilians from conflict-related physical violence, including throughout the establishment of a safe and secure environment. When the local population in NATO operations and missions are threatened, NATO focuses on understanding the needs, the vulnerabilities, and threats to the people in order to work with relevant local and international authorities. NATO's commitment to the overarching protection of civilians mandate is indisputable. We continue to harness our operational experiences to robust strategic guidance throughout the development of training and education on protection of civilians in conjunction with the UN and other international organizations. Drawing on experiences from Kosovo and Afghanistan, NATO and its partners have developed specific policies and guidelines for the protection of civilians in the planning and in conduct of NATO-led operations and missions. At the Warsaw Summit in 2016, NATO leaders adopted a NATO policy for the protection of civilians. The aim of this overarching policy is to set out a coherent, consistent, and integrated approach to the protection of civilians in NATO-led operations, missions, and other mandated activities. The policy was developed with NATO partners and in consultation with the UN and other relevant international organizations, and is today part of the human security approach of the alliance. But in recent years, NATO has made considerable progress in implementing this policy, both at political and military levels. It has achieved this throughout tailored training that includes partners, by integrating protection of civilians into NATO exercises, and by ensuring its integration into NATO's doctrine and planning as well. The protection of civilians, which means persons, objects and services, includes all efforts taken to avoid, minimize and mitigate the negative effects that might arise from NATO and NATO-led military operations on the civilian population. When applicable, it also includes efforts to protect civilians from conflict-related physical violence or threats of physical violence by other actors. These efforts consist of a range of activities including the use of force to prevent, deter, preempt, and respond to situations in which civilians suffer or are under threats of physical violence. To be effective, our policy on protection of civilians explicitly emphasizes also the importance of stability policing in relation to training of local police forces, which can be critical to protect the civilian population during or after a conflict. Directly quoting, understanding the nature of the threats against civilians is critical for identifying if the use of military force, including a stability policing dimension, can protect the civilian population. Within the protection sphere, as a means to better protect girls and boys, we need to ramp up our efforts to address violations against children in conflict, which also includes developing training and capacity building tools. Protecting children in armed conflict is both a moral imperative and an essential element to break cycles of violence. Protecting children in conflict today prevents conflicts of the future. NATO recognizes that protection of children in conflict has primacy in NATO-led operations and missions, and the Alliance, with the support of the UN, has made progress in developing practical, field-oriented measures to address conflict-related violations against children. As human security is the interconnected tissue between all cross-cutting areas that can create a condition for security that will allow all people to live free from abuse and violence, we must recognize that different populations require different protection mechanisms. Addressing the protection needs of women and girls is essential. The long-term destructive nature of conflict-related sexual violence, as well as its great effect on entire communities, continues to pose significant threats to global peace and security. This has led to an increased expectation that actors, including NATO military personnel operating in conflict and post-conflict settings, are mandated to protect civilians, take a more prominent role in addressing this issue. Combating sexual violence in conflict and focusing on operational effective responses to this, appalling abuse of women and girls, but also we say on men and boys, is critical. Conflict-related sexual violence is a tactic of war. It is the use of rape as a weapon to destroy communities, intimidate, and to terrorize populations, and as a means of displacing people. Even after these wars end, sexual violence often goes under-addressed. The long-term destructive nature of conflict-related sexual violence, as well as its effect on the entire communities, continues to pose significant threats to global peace and security. Awareness that conflict-related sexual violence not only affects women and girls, but the entire communities, is now entrenched in our collective thinking. The elevation of sexual violence as an international peace and security issue has led to an increased expectation that actors, including NATO, take a more prominent role in addressing and preventing sexual violence. Sexual violence stems from fundamental gender inequalities. Focusing on solely protective and preventive solutions is limited and insufficient. To effectively address sexual violence, it must address and dismantle all obstacles that impede women's full participation in peace and security and in all political life. This is why a NATO policy on conflict-related sexual violence was adopted by Allied Defense Ministers in June last year and lately endorsed during the Brussels summit. A further area under my remit, and that is tragically omnipresent in conflict worldwide, human trafficking. 70% of the victims of human trafficking are women and girls, and increasingly human trafficking has been identified as a national security threat. one that straddles the line between a crime against an individual and one against human dignity. Various international organizations have estimated that hundreds of thousands of victims of trafficking each year, and human trafficking is a significant source of revenue for criminal organizations, whose activities may destabilize legitimate governments. Therefore, human trafficking is a human and peace and security threat. The NATO policy of combating trafficking on human beings from 2004 reiterates that trafficking constitutes a serious abuse of human rights, especially affecting primarily women and children. The United Nations Security Council recognizes that human trafficking in areas affected by armed conflict can exist for the purpose of various forms of exploitation, such as the use of child soldiers, exploitation and prostitution, or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, removal and of organs. Trafficking in human beings has, however, grown with intensity since the adoption of the NATO policy. A booming human trafficking industry is bolstering criminal and terrorist enterprises, especially in the Mediterranean, and the threat posed by human trafficking networks to women and girls has grown exponentially. To address the challenges and trends of recent years, we are currently working on the update of NATO's policy on human trafficking and planning to have it agreed by allies by the beginning of next year. Finally, on cultural property protection. NATO recognizes cultural property protection as an essential consideration in the military environment and a critical indicator of community security, cohesion, and identity. As demonstrated by the conflicts in the Western Balkans in the 90s, the destruction of cultural symbols can have significant political dimension and become a tactic used to weaken affected communities. Recognizing the linkage with a broader protection agenda, cultural property protection is an important aspect of NATO's human security approach to operations and missions and a valuable component of NATO's efforts to build peace and security. We are currently approaching the drafting and subsequent adoption of a policy of cultural property protection for NATO. Safeguarding the freedom, common heritage and civilization of people remains a priority for the Alliance and for me personally. I'm well aware that today's main focus is on Afghanistan. However, I cannot but briefly speak to the current situation in Ukraine. It has been more than 4 months since Putin's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, and we are all continuing to bear witness to the brutality and cruelty of this conflict, and to the human toll that is having on the whole of Ukrainian society. Allow me to provide a few examples assessing the very gender and human impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, men between the age of 18 and 60 are no longer allowed to leave the country, while women and children are forced to seek refuge abroad, resulting in more than half of Ukrainians now living apart from their families. Before the war, women made up the 15% of the Ukrainian armed forces. But since February 24, more women are taking up arms to stand against their aggressor, using all means to defend their children, their homes, and their heritage. There are currently 37 women combating. This is to show the difference, as I said, the pillar of the resolution. On one side, women as a victim, being victim of sexual abuse, of trafficking, but at the same time, women are taking up the arms and participating in defending the war. So it's always important to look at the full picture when we address the role of women in conflict. And I want to stress this because a lot of the narrative in this conflict around Ukraine has been about women as a victim of this war. Women as a victim of, as I say victim in this case, and not a survivor, because many of them have been also killed, conflict-related sexual violence in Bucha, in Irpin, and in many other places. And the narrative is less about women participating, taking arms, but also participating in political dialogues. We all remember this picture of the first attempt of negotiation dialogue where only men were sitting from both sides. So a lot has been said on this, that women are totally absent. And that's a fact. It's true. No women were present at this high-level I would not call peace dialogue, but so dialogue between the two parties. But I'm in contact with women at different levels, with ministers, with parliamentarians, with civil society. And I want to share with you that women do participate in the political life now. There is a women general prosecutor that is already prosecuting the first perpetrators of conflict of sexual violence. There are ministers in charge of negotiating the release of prisoners of war, Irene Fellin, and I know that as part of the negotiations, she's always asking that women are part of all this exchange. So the gender dimension of this is present. She was negotiating the release of the soldier in Azovstal in Mariupol when this was happening. So maybe also the narrative and the way in which we represent women has to change, because often women are present, are actively taking part in the resolution of the conflict, but the way in which we are building the narrative, we, and I say we, or our journalists and the media, is still very much patriarchal and gender in a negative way. So I think I want to share this message also for you to leave this room also to say that maybe we have to look other sources and to find this news and to find these messages and to amplify the voices of women as part of our own commitment to advance this agenda. As in most conflict, the worth of our humanity is on display. As we said also, the reported sexual violence brought out again this phenomenon under our eyes. Something that we have been discussed at NATO recently is that maybe we should change our approach, not waiting that to have the information about the cases of sexual violence in conflict. We know that this happens, unfortunately. So maybe when we approach our analysis, we should already work on the prevention, starting from the assumption that this is part of the conflict. And by saying that, I don't want to say that this is inevitable. On the contrary, it's exactly because we can't prevent this from happening that we need to have this gender analysis as part of our work in operational planning and our work, when we approach conflict. And this is also why in the past month, something new has developed during my work at NATO. I am regularly briefing both the NAC and the military committee on the gender perspective of this conflict. This is something new. It's also new what we are experiencing, I would say, at NATO. So as part of the regular updates on Ukraine, I also go and try to provide injection of the gender analysis, because this is fundamental to be done at an early stage. And we all know that when we look at the reconstruction, the gender analysis has to be part of how we plan our intervention, because otherwise we know that as an add-on, it will be a failure. To conclude, I believe that lessons learned and conferences as the one you organize today and the entire workshop organized during the past week are pivotal for a better readiness and preparedness for current and future crises we will face as an alliance. Reflecting on lessons learned, we continue to shore up the work of our collective protection mandate by building up an institutional capacity, training, and dedicated resources. This is a vital part of helping to create lasting cultural changes and deepening understanding of the centrality of protection and rights for the whole population. To look to the future of crisis prevention and management and peace support, we understand that emerging security threats are creating a new set of challenges for the international community. As NATO evolves to take into account changing geopolitical dynamics, recognizing the potential of human security approaches and including stability in policing will be key. We engage with partners and other international organizations in a way that supports the rule-based international order and enhance peace and stability well beyond where NATO is directly engaged. This includes training based on our experience, and this is particularly important in relation to our partners. The human security challenges I have outlined are challenges we share, and shared challenges provide opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. Cooperation with a network of NATO centers of excellence is also fundamental and mutually beneficial. They represent an important source of information and knowledge. We need to remain best prepared for the challenges of today and tomorrow, and continue to keep our people safe. Thank you for your attention.